Hey guys, Tara here for Destructoid, and if I look super nervous today, it's because I'm sitting here with the one and only Ken Levine talking about BioShock Infinite. How are you doing?
I am great. Happy to be in San Francisco.
Yeah, we're happy to have you here. I think the last time I talked to you was a couple years ago at E3 2011, and you guys had just shown off the very first live demo of BioShock Infinite.
Yes.
And now, many years later, we come back, and how in games with long development cycles like this does the game change from the time when you first showed off to when it comes out?
They change a lot. I mean, the challenge is, like writers when they write, they don't have to take out their first drafts and show it to everybody. They don't have to publish that. As a game developer, because of the length of the cycles and because of the requirements of press and marketing, all that, you kind of have to take it out there. We actually like that because those periods we have to show it to people sort of make you honest. Like, okay, is this actually cool or does it kind of suck and we've just been doing it for a long time? So that E3 demo was really helpful because it really defined what the gameplay loop of the game was going to be. In terms of how it felt to be with Elizabeth, how the combat felt, how the skylines felt. And so that was really useful for us, but we also realized after doing that demo, holy crap, we've really written ourselves a big check that we now have to cash, and so that we had a lot of work to do.
In games like this that are very narrative intensive, it seems like you sometimes forget that you're actually playing a shooter because there's such a good disconnect between the story and the really emotional moments and the really crazy action intensive sequences. How do you sort of strike a good balance there?
It's weird because games are kind of weird because they're like a mix of narrative and they're a mix of this sort of skill component, right? It's sort of I think of it like musical theater. It's like people are talking and then all of a sudden they start singing or dancing, which is odd, but it's part of the form.
Right.
And the more we when back in the Doom days, that wasn't really a problem because none of it felt real. It all felt gamey. And then when you start getting into these sort of characters who have some emotional resonance and you start getting some emotional connections, you have to then sort of deal with that. There's I don't know how far you've gotten so far, but there's a bit early on where Elizabeth reacts to violence in the world, and just begging that question of a character recognizing that there's violence in the world and having an emotional reaction to it is something difficult to do in a game because the violence is in these shooters is substantial, but we wanted to make sure that her reaction to it colored her character and helped change her character through the course of the game, because otherwise I think we would turn off to her.
Speaking to the combat, do you feel like it's fundamentally different in this game than it was in previous BioShocks?
I think some of it's very similar. The whole weapon and plasmid or weapon and vigor and some amount of internal loadout and using the environment. I think just the scale of it changes everything. You've got these huge spaces and you're fighting 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 enemies, and you've got guys who make huge leaps and you're zipping around on the skylines, and Elizabeth being there too, having that you're not totally relied upon yourself, that those are great moments when you're you're shooting somebody and you click on your last round of ammo and you hear Booker and you turn and she's tossing you a gun and you just grab that and you have that sort of emotional connection to her, thanks, that's a powerful feeling, like your friend helped you out. So those things are additions. So I think it's mostly additive, but I think it's very much a BioShock combat. We just keep sort of expanding the vocabulary of that.
Yeah, I think the vertical combat, at least for what I've played of the game, is definitely the most different thing about it. Is that something that you guys knew that you wanted to put in from the very beginning? Like what came first, the floating city or the SkyHook combat?
The floating city, and we had this city in the sky. First two things we had were the time period and then the floating city. Because the floating city, if you looked at the art at the time, like the science fiction art, there's a ton of floating cities. There are all these sort of these floating cities with these guys walking around with their top hats, and they were really charming to see, and we wanted to sort of play with that space. But then once we had the floating city, we thought about Rapture, and we decided that, to be honest with ourselves, to be honest with our audience, we didn't really pay off the water in the sense that there's nothing about being at the bottom of the ocean that you really were just in a dungeon.
Right, it just looked cool.
It just looked cool. It was art, and it was great art, but it looked cool. And even the water coming in, it could have been you could have been in a basement and water could have been coming in. So we really wanted to make sure this was real sky. This felt like sky. It felt meaningful. And so then the question was, well, how do we do that? Do we embrace the verticality? And well, how do we embrace the verticality? And people have done this before. There are, jetpacks and, cool, whatever, flying cars and stuff like that. But we want to do something different. And I always had this theory, which may be right or may be wrong, that like the most powerful sort of vertical experience I've ever been on is a roller coaster. And part of the reason that is because a roller coaster is both in control and out of control at the same time. You know that the odds of you actually getting hurt are beyond remote. I mean, it can happen, but it's really mathematically unlikely. But yet you scream when you're on the thing, you just can't help it. We had this guy, Adrian Balanon came on, who just also really sort of knew how to make that feel good, make all those curves feel good and that sense of motion feel good. Because if we didn't have that, then it just wouldn't be exciting.
Yeah. This actually brings up a topic that I wanted to ask you about, which is multiplayer, which is something that I think you said you guys sort of toyed around with the idea of early on and then decided not to go there. Are you yourself a fan of multiplayer games, and is this something you see ever coming to the BioShock series?
Yeah, look, I was the first guy who said, look, let's try this thing we were trying. And because I'm a co-op player, really. You can imagine, I get totally noob slaughtered if I go out on like a Call of Duty server. It's hopeless. I enjoy it, but I'm not very good at it. But co-op I enjoy, but it was tough because it had to be something unique to us. Like, I think the first game we made that didn't have multiplayer was BioShock, and it was by far our most successful game. And so I think that the last thing I would do is throw something in the box that just so we can put a bullet point. And we worked on it for a while, and and I think that we were very hesitant to talk about it. People would ask us about it, and we'd sort of say, well, we work on a lot of things, but we're not announcing anything because we didn't want to make people think it was coming. And then at one point we just decided, we don't have the time, resource, or mostly the mind space to work on it. I'm not like one of those guys who goes and contributes a tiny bit to here, tiny bit to here. I really feel I have to be committed to what I'm working on, and if I can. And I just didn't have the mind space for it, and the team didn't have the bandwidth for it, so we just said, you know what, maybe another day.
Well, that's another one of these issues, I think, that's sort of, between when you guys started on the game and now, the landscape of gaming has sort of changed since then, and especially with regards to multiplayer, a lot of people are saying now that games that started out as narrative-driven experiences don't necessarily need that multiplayer component, and I personally feel like, in a lot of cases, for story-intensive games, it can cheapen the experience. Do you agree with that at all?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think multiplayer is naturally goofy. I don't mean that in a slight against multiplayer. It's just respawning and shooting each other, and the sort of just the nature of it is the chaotic nature of it doesn't really reflect combat. It doesn't really reflect much of anything. It's a sport, effectively, right? And I think that you do want to be careful, that you don't cheapen the experience, because people, especially I think with BioShock games, they have this sort of emotional connection to things. And I think that's where you see some of the sort of various scandals or outrages you see about it, because people feel an attachment to it. And if you don't respect that attachment, you reap the whirlwind, I think, because you're benefiting from that, but you also have to respect that attachment and not give them something that is cynical or not well thought out.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that'll be a problem with this game. I'm really curious to see what people think of it. I myself could not be more excited. We're going to have a couple more interviews up over on our Rev3 Games channel that Adam Sessler will be doing, and they will focus a little bit more on the narrative aspects of the game. So if you are at all looking forward to those, then be sure to check those out. Ken, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good luck with your launch.
Thank you.